So y'all, I am going to get started. And for those of you already here, I did just turn on the recording function. Um, we'll record this meeting and then at the end, we'll stop recording for any questions. But if you have questions while we're talking that you don't mind being recorded, feel free to just interrupt me and go ahead and ask those. I'm certainly open to asking questions whenever you have them. And thank you for joining us. It's our legislative debrief. It's actually been a while, or it feels like a really long time, but it's really only been a couple weeks since the legislature left, finally adjourned. So the 112th session is over, and barring any special sessions, fingers crossed, the 113th session will begin January 10th, 2023. So we will hopefully have some time before we are heading back to Nashville. So it's a good time for a deep breath, a hooray, we survived, a sigh, we survived, but it was really hard. Whatever your response is to the session that we just had, because it was a lot. It was a big session. So this is our debrief, and we'll cover a variety of things in it. We'll start by talking about some of the progress that we made in Tennessee. Those are the happy things. We'll try to focus on the positives as much as we can. We'll also talk about some of the steps back we took and some of the really negative things that happened. Some of the lessons learned, some were new, some were just reaffirmed for us, and how they're going to frame our work moving forward. And then we'll take a second to really look at how we're going to move forward in Tennessee, and take a second to acknowledge the time that we're in and how difficult it is for women and for families, not just in Tennessee, but really across the country. So when we talk about progress, we'll talk about it really from a broad lens. We'll narrow down and name a couple bills, but I want to look more at a big picture about what happened in the legislature this session, and then keep narrowing it down from there. So there were some really phenomenal issue-based wins. And when I say issue-based, I just mean issues that saw traction this year in Nashville. Not surprisingly, there was some human trafficking awareness and survivor support. This is a place where we've really been able to count on Tennessee on both sides of the aisle supporting progress. And that continued this year in a number of ways that I will mention in more detail later. So that was great. I think that there were, well, there definitely were some positive bills pertaining to maternal health. And there were also a number of really great conversations that took place in various committees around maternal health. And a lot of that work was led by some of our partners. I want to name Healthy and Free Tennessee. They had two really important bills passed this year. And it's a place where we still have so much to do, because mothers and their babies are not healthy in Tennessee. They're not safe in Tennessee. And so we'll continue to work on this, but there was real progress this year. There were a number of great conversations about domestic violence and protections for victims and support for victims. That was refreshing. Lots of times when we hear about domestic violence legislation in Tennessee, it's just about increasing punishments, and it's not about protecting and supporting the people who have lived through the trauma. And I think some of that was a little different this year, and that's a really great thing. And also conversations about pre-K really garnered a lot of tension and were really productive in a number of committees. That's important because for whatever reason, Tennessee is really narrowed in on pre-K, and we're going to have to show progress and do great things in our pre-K system to really reach out and do the childcare infrastructure and the childcare changes that we need to take place to move forward on childcare. And so the conversation moving on pre-K, I hope, is a good sign that we will continue to have conversations about childcare next year. And so these are areas where we did see some significant progress. And that, is a reason to celebrate. These are really important issues, and we did see some movement on them. In particular, there were 9 bills on our priority list, 8 that passed that we were in favor of, and 1 that was stopped that we were opposed to, that we count as wins this year. And that's a great number. I'm really excited about it. I didn't actually see that many wins when I was trying to prophetically predict what was going to happen in the session. One of our proactive bills passed, and this was a bill that requires education about human trafficking for public school employees, not just teachers. Previously in Tennessee, we required that teachers were educated about human trafficking. This is a wider net. It includes the people who are on campus and see students and work with students beyond just teachers. We also, as any of you who are familiar with our work know, we are constantly monitor and fighting some marriage licensing legislation. And once again, it was stopped this year. So that's great. There's a big movement, well, not even a big movement. There's a really wealthy single issue organization that is committed to changing some of our marriage processes in Tennessee. So this bill has come up the last 3 years. I anticipate it will be back next year to change the licensing procedures, but in every way that's been proposed, doing so would put either children or trafficking victims at risk. And so we'll continue to fight against that. 7 additional priorities passed, including the Crown Act, which is a huge pass for Tennessee. Breast cancer preventative care screening is now included in TennCare coverage. I'm embarrassed that it took us till now, but grateful that it is finally included in Tennessee. And an exfunction bill for survivors of trafficking passed. And this is a bill that no one was talking about, but that is really impactful and a huge change, and something that in 2019, when the Women's Fund wrote the exfunction law for survivors of human trafficking, saying that they could get all of the nonviolent offenses that they accrued on their records while they were victims and essentially being forced to act, they could get all of those expunged by filling out a single form. When we had first written it, there were some concerns from some lawmakers, and they insisted that one of the caveats in the bill be that one of the prosecutions and one of the things on their record had to be for prostitution. And this bill that passed this year took that away. So even if a victim of trafficking has never been convicted of prostitution, that individual can still get their record expunged. And that's really important because too often we talk about trafficking as if it's only sex trafficking, and we want to steer away from saying sex trafficking because there are an array of different kinds of trafficking situations. And we want to make sure that all victims who are able to escape that life have a real opportunity at life, which they can't have with prolific criminal records. Healthy and Free Tennessee led on 2 great bills when we're talking about maternal health in our state. The first is the anti-shackling legislation that finally passed in Tennessee, which prohibits shackling of pregnant incarcerated people except under extreme circumstances. I believe they worked on this for 4 years. We've supported them every year. It took 4 years to stop shackling pregnant people, but it passed, and that's what matters. And then also they passed what we're calling a doula study bill, and it's requiring a comprehensive study of the impact of doulas on maternal health, with the hope that then we will be able to follow up with their leadership to get doulas covered by insurance plans in the future. A victim notification bill passed that will require that the system where those with complaints against them, orders of protection out against them, and that sort of thing. Their victims can be notified whenever anything happens with them, right? So if they're arrested again, if they're found in violation of their order, any of those things, now the victims are notified, and it's going to streamline the process so that they receive the notifications. They can set it up directly to their phone. This was inspired by a case where a victim was not informed that the person who had threatened to kill her was arrested again, and then released again, and didn't know all of the circumstances leading up to her eventually being murdered. So we're grateful to see that. And then there was another trafficking education bill that is requiring public employees across a variety of our state's departments to be educated to recognize human trafficking. So these are just bills that were on our priority list that we did see pass. In no way does it mean our whole priority list passed, but 9 bills, I'm really, really pleased with that. And there were also some other really positive things that did happen in terms of conversations around other things. So other things that happened that were positive that we should, really stop to look at is, going back to pre-K. These weren't on our priority list, but pre-K funding is now included in some elementary school formulas, which is really important. For those of you not familiar with the pre-K system in Tennessee, we have a voluntary pre-K system, but you have to meet certain metrics to be able to utilize it in the public schools, but they don't always have funding. So they may have a pre-K program, but they can't actually, they might be assigned to have one, but they can't actually implement it to the full extent to reach the largest number of families. And also the pre-K expansion eventually failed, but it went through, I believe, 5 different committees and conversations about why we need expanded access to pre-K for families. And like I said in the introduction, I think that this is something that I know the Women's Fund will dig into more, and that I'd like to be more knowledgeable in, because I think with the direction that Tennessee is going, this is what's going to lead into some childcare changes and some childcare infrastructure changes for younger children that we need so critically for women in the workforce and families in the workforce, really. Those of you who have been involved with the Women's Fund for a long time are familiar with the idea of fetal assault legislation, which is when a pregnant person could potentially be penalized for their actions and their behaviors if they are believed to put the embryo or the fetus at risk, right? So what we know is that when bills like this pass, pregnant people who, for example, may have a drug problem or may be living in poverty and may not have access to all the things that are recommended that they do as a pregnant person, are suddenly scared to ask for help, or suddenly scared to ask for the things they do need because they could be penalized for not having access to them or for having a problem, and they could be seeking help but face penalty instead. That bill was stopped again, which is wildly important. It was written this year from a new perspective, because they were trying to make all child abuse legislation pertain to embryos and fetuses as well as born children. So we'll have to continue to watch that. I suspect we'll see it again. We see it almost every year in some form or fashion. And another really important bill that I just want to lift up, because it was shocking to me that we still needed this to be legislation. And I think sometimes people don't realize how many holes there are in processes and in policy that need to be filled. But a service of process legislation was passed saying if someone is served or is charged with a crime, that they also need to have their record checked to see if there's an arrest warrant out for them before they're released. That's all. So we know that someone was charged with something, was in one of our jails in Tennessee. There wasn't a full search of that person's record. That person happened to have have an arrest warrant out for domestic violence offense. They were released after getting arrested again, and there were really horrible consequences. And so now there is a law that requires that there needs to be a comprehensive search done of people's records before they're released. Again, I was surprised that needed to be a law, but I'm grateful that it is now. So I want to lift that up. That was some really great work by our partners at the coalition, both discovering that hole and then leading on the legislation to get that passed. But y'all, the bad. And I'm going to try to focus more on the positive, but we do have to talk about the bad. And this year was brutal by all measures. It was crazy. I mean, it was just a crazy year in Nashville. There were multiple criminal investigations going on of legislators. So there were lots of increased emotions and feelings across the board. And there was a lot of just sort of trying to appeal to a base by some folks, depending on where they're aiming to be reelected. There was some commitment to distancing themselves from others. And it was just pretty horrible. And there were a number of really great bills that failed. And you know, some of those are bills that we will continue to support in the future until they don't fail. And we've talked about pre-K. We still are not getting as much traction on paid leave as we would like to. This is, you know, paid leave, family leave, medical leave, paid sick leave. It's critically important to a healthy, productive workforce for our communities, for our economy, for our state. And we're not seeing traction on that because there's this protect the businesses sort of mentality, when in fact, all research indicates that the businesses would fare better with a loyal and maintained workforce with paid leave policy. Our partners at A Better Balance lead on our paid leave work. We will continue to partner with them and support that in every way that we can. I was really disappointed in particular by some of our local legislators, either reluctance to engage in a conversation about paid leave or surprising us with some comments and votes about paid leave that we weren't anticipating. So we'll also dig in just here at home with folks to have more conversations. Bills continue to fail that remove local preemptions. Again, those of you who have been involved with the Women's Fund long and have been on many of these calls with me know that preemptions really get my goat, like they get me angry. A preemption is when, I just said get my goat, a preemption is when the state takes away the authority of a smaller government, so the counties and the cities. Or when the federal government takes away the authority of the states. It could go either way. But there were some really great bills to remove some local preemptions on things, and they didn't move. And it's just this really convoluted circle of small government versus big government versus what we really do. And finding a way to dig into that conversation and argument and getting people to understand that if you are loyally small government, then you need to respect each level of government to get it done. And even if you're not, the fact is that local governments know some issues better than state governments as they pertain to their populations. And that's certainly the case when it comes to workforce protections and what the actual economic structure is of a small region. So we'll continue to support those. A real heartbreaker failing was the advocate confidentiality bill that we have been lobbying alongside Awake. They've been leading on for, gosh, this might have been the fourth year, might be 3 or 4 years. That's the bill that says that the advocates working in crisis centers, whether they're rape crisis centers or child abuse centers, have the same protections pertaining to confidentiality as other licensed individuals, so that victims feel safe going in and talking to folks. And unfortunately, though it passed the Senate last year, it still did not pass the House, and we believed it was going to this year. So that was rough. Then there were some bills that didn't move at all, right? We didn't even get to have conversations about them. And so that's the worst. One was our economic abuse legislation in the House. We never even got it introduced in committee, though we did have some great conversations in the Senate, and we do have a very clear plan moving forward with it for next year with the support of the House leadership. Because it's a new session, it'll be a complete start over on that. Other bills that we never had conversations about were a bill introduced to strengthen firearms surrender legislation in Tennessee. If you are convicted of a crime that requires that you surrender your firearms, you just have to sign a sheet of paper saying, I promise to surrender my firearms, and I understand that I'm required to do that. Cool. I'm glad that you promised on a piece of paper. Another one that, we didn't even see introduced, it ended up being amended to something completely different, was campaign finance changes for caregivers, which is something we really support, but that there wasn't going to be any support for in committee, saying that people running for office can use some of their campaign contributions to support the childcare that's required for them to run for office, right? We want to see more caregivers, guardians, parents out there running and representing families in our legislature and in our local governments. But if we can't find a way to make that economically feasible for them, then we can't. And this is a real problem with sort of some of the elitist policies pertaining to campaign finance and political participation that we want to see undercut. Healthy and Free had another really great bill that just didn't gain traction this year, I think because they were just really dug in and moving on other bills. And that is to provide a support person for pregnant incarcerated people. Right now, they can't have a friendly face with them when they're in labor or, giving birth. And we'd like to see that change. And then the really bad, which are the horrible bills that passed. The Human Rights Commission here in Tennessee is in serious, serious jeopardy. A bill passed that is, I hope I summarized this right, eliminating the current board and allowing for the new appointment of an entirely new board with the ultimate gain, because there has been a collection of legislators and other folks in the state with the ultimate goal of eliminating the Human Rights Commission in Tennessee. And this was the first bill to pass that really showed progress on that path, dismantling their board and allowing, I believe, the legislature and the governor to appoint the new board, taking away any of the autonomy of this commission that should be protecting folks' rights, which is super problematic. Tennessee had a couple versions of a Don't Say Gay bill in education, right? We can no longer have textbooks that reference gay or transgendered folks in schools. We passed a pronoun discrimination law that essentially says that teachers and school employees are not required to use the students' preferred pronouns. We passed laws preventing trans students from participating in sports at multiple levels. These are all big problems for a lot of reasons, mostly because they're cruel. And the censorship support bills weren't just about excluding any textbooks that make reference to gay or transgendered people. There's also some censorship bills about the schools in our public school library, or the books in our public school libraries. I'm sure you've read about some of those. They've been all over the news. They are very dangerous. Reproductive rights restrictions were passed, which is wild because, like, how are there more things that they can pass in Tennessee? But these restrictions go all the way to schools not being able to contract with nonprofit organizations who work with organizations who provide abortion and comprehensive sex education that mentions things like gender rights. And there was the elimination of anonymous reporting for child abuse cases. So, I mean, when we talk about the bad is really, really bad. And that resonates in the current climate of today. It just makes our work that much more important. I think we have to put this in a frame of look at where we're living and the time that we're living in right now. The obvious is we know that Roe is going to be overturned because of the leak. And, most of us kind of knew before the leak. But we're also living in a time where parents can't actually even get the formula they need to feed their children. Where costs of products are skyrocketing and inflation is going to continue to impact people. And, in one of the ways that we're watching, one of the kinds of products that we've seen with the highest rates of cost increase are diapers. And now we have a formula shortage. And we already know that there are a lot of folks, who need access to these things. And there are going to be a lot more folks who need access to these things when essentially starting a family is no longer a choice, right? So it's a dangerous, kind of scary time with a lot of work to be done. And we're working with great partners to make sure that work is done. And we're going to make sure that folks have diapers. We're going to dig into what can be done about the pipeline for formula. But what's happening in our legislature, we sometimes just want to throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, Tennessee. But it's really reflective of what's happening in a lot of places around the country. And that's obvious from some of the national trends that we're observing and some of the things we need to do to combat them. So what did we learn this session? Oh, so many things. First of all, the power of our partners, which will continue to be a strong focus for the future. This work cannot be done alone. Our partner organizations lift up issues that we support, and they support us on the issues that we lift up. And every year I don't want to say I'm surprised, but I'm definitely humbled by the partnerships that we have across Tennessee. The value of the coalitions and alliances that we work with. And this year more than ever, multiple times, there were partners who I could call on and say, hey, I'm not on the Hill. This is happening. Can you talk to this person for me? And no one ever said no, right? And so that's more than ever something that's incredibly important, is making sure our network includes enough folks that there's always someone to talk to the right person at the right moment. Because no matter how frequently I'm up there, the Women's Fund is not in Nashville all the time. And the other thing this year more than ever that I saw across our partners and across our partnerships and alliances was a lot of collaborative strategy. And that's really cool. There are a lot of great organizations working on behalf of women, their families, their communities, and who are really willing to share collective knowledge about certain legislators, what they will or will not respond to, meeting with them, how to approach them. And I just feel like that has really started to pay off as we see some of these bills that we've been working on for 2 and 3 and 4 years starting to have conversations or pass. And so the power of partners cannot be overstated. It's when I'm making my work plan for what I do now until next session, a big part of it is making sure I know how I can continue to support them out of session, because they are what help us be successful beyond just the bills that we introduce and that we lead on. And in contrast to that, the range of our adversaries was another solid learning lesson for me. I think that most people would say I'm pretty adept at figuring out who the people opposed to the bills that we're supporting are going to be. And this year I was reminded about just how long and how far some organizations have a reach and how deeply they'll reach. And so many of you know that we try to be really strategic about what bills we lead on from the Women's Fund, in part because we like to win, but in larger part because we want to be good stewards of all of the Women's Fund supporters. And there are some bills, because of who the opponents are and our limited capacity, we're not sure we would be great stewards of our donors and of our members if we advocated for them. and we led on them. And we don't want to expend all of our resources in a fight, say, against the NRA, because there's a lot of NRA money, for example. And I missed the connection this year, and I'm, that the gun lobby would be really opposed to economic abuse legislation being added to the domestic violence code, because someone else's gun might be taken from them if they're found to be a domestic abuser. If we broaden that definition, we will put it at risk. The good news about that is, though it essentially stopped us to some degree this year, it's not something that even the leadership of both parties believes will stop us as we continue to move forward. But that's just a really good example of like the range of our adversaries and the depth of their pockets and the number of folks that they can have watching things, because there were a lot of other bills that were a lot more directly related to gun ownership and the like, but they still had time to dig in on economic abuse. And I'll say this, the Senate Judiciary Committee was great at just kind of like poo-pawing their disagreements. And we had a really great support in Senate Judiciary to move forward with it, but we couldn't move in the House because they were not comfortable moving against the gun lobby, because it's not just the NRA. There are, I think, 5 major gun rights lobbying organizations in Tennessee. So it froze in the House, and that means we'll be starting over with it next session, hopefully with some more support, but with a new Senate Judiciary Chair, because Senator Bell is not running for re-election. And so we're not sure how that will go. But knowing the adversaries and not ever underestimating them, because there are some we always know, but I missed that one. The other thing that we learned is that everything we know right now could really change by next session. And that's the best news ever. When I say a chamber in transition, I really mean the House. The House in Tennessee is in transition. 15 House members are not coming back. So there will necessarily, regardless of what happens in every other election, be 15 new faces, starting the 113th session compared to the 112th. There have also been a number of really clear divides in the House over the last couple of years with criminal investigations and ethics reform and some of the issues that have come forward. And we're looking at sort of the biggest shift in the House composition since I've been there. And I don't anticipate the party numbers are going to change a whole lot. But there are new faces, and there are new people, and there are new lines being drawn and new issues sort of being lifted up. And that gives us nothing short of a lot of opportunity going into next year, because there are going to be at least 15 new people that we can talk to, and we can explain these issues to through an economic lens and through a public safety lens, so that they will perhaps become allies and sponsors and support some of the work that we and our partners are leading on. And just like every year, half of the Senate every election year is up for re-election. And as I already mentioned, one of the biggest changes we're going to see in the makeup of the Senate is a new Judiciary Chair, and that's going to really impact how we can move on. The other learning lesson from this session is just the value of voices, more and more and more voices. I don't know what changed this year, if it was like everything being like fully back after the pandemic, but legislative assistants were super quick when I walked in their offices to tell me how many folks they'd heard from on bills, what they were saying, how many of them were their constituents, how many of them weren't. Like, they were counting in ways that I've never really had them report to me before. That's not entirely true. The late Representative Carter's assistant would always give me her numbers. She was amazing. But legislators that I was just forming friendships with this year, their assistants would be like, oh, we've gotten this many calls. And I had legislators who had never before mentioned it to me also mention it to me. And so they were listening. Some of that was in the House because it's an election year, which I think is important to put in our pocket and keep in mind. But it was also, from some of our senators, some of whom are not up for reelection. So, putting that learning, in our back pocket and saying, so this is what we need to do, and keeping an eye on what they're counting next year is going to be wildly important. Because I'll tell you now, last year, I could ask assistants who I have great relationships with how many people called, and they'd be like, I don't know. Like, I wasn't really counting. Bless them for their honesty. So, but it was a good learning year for me, I think for a lot of our partners, and certainly for a lot of our relationships that we have on the Hill. And so now we have to move forward. And normally, when it comes to moving forward, I would say the first thing on our list of things to do is renew, take some time, rest, take care of ourselves. But the reality is that right now there are a lot of really big issues on a national stage that require not just our knowledge, but our looking into local solutions, like the formula shortages, like the cost of inflation on people trying to get basic needs for their families, like housing insecurity, like some of the employment numbers that are coming up. And so we're going to have to dig in, to look at how we can work locally with folks to provide some solutions to some of those things. But then we're going to reassess the legislation that we're planning to move with, the legislation that we either have sponsors for or need new sponsors for, and the arguments that we make for and against legislation are going to have to be assessed and evaluated and probably changed in a lot of ways. And we're going to have to realign our position with our legislators and with our partners to figure out how are we most impactful? How is the Women's Fund most impactful? We need alliances and partners. How do we lift those up to make the most change? Because on the one hand, we are ready to run with a couple proactive pieces of legislation in 2023. If 2023 was a month from now, we'd be ready to roll. But those are only a couple pieces, and that's where our capacity is. So how do we realign with folks to make sure that we are contributing to the greatest number of positive bills and fighting against the greatest number of negative bills to lift up families? And with that, that's sort of my debrief. I didn't include bill numbers or nitty gritty, though I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about some nitty gritty and some detail. So I'm going to stop recording, and I will be happy to answer any